do not need this like standard practice of trial by jury or something to deport an illegal alien.
You have no lawyer, you have no recourse to get out. That's dystopian. That's horrifying.
Yeah, and it should scare all of us.
We have to focus on what Trump is doing more than what he's saying. That's always been a good rule of thumb. But one thing he is doing is a total 180 on the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who the Trump administration says is an MS-13 gangbanger who Democrats have described as a Maryland man, but he is an undocumented or illegal immigrant who'd lived here for a long time. And they sent him to El Salvador, the Trump administration did originally, in violation of a court order. Now they brought him back. We're going to take a listen to some news coverage of that.
A plot twist. The Salvadoran migrant mistakenly deported from Maryland to a MAGA prison in his home country has been returned to the United States to face human smuggling charges. A federal grand jury has indicted Kilmar Abrego Garcia on 2 counts for allegedly transporting thousands of illegal immigrants across the United States, including children and MS-13 gang members.
So I have thoughts on this, but my first thought is I have a short memory, but I'm not quite a goldfish. So I do remember a number of statements from the Trump administration, including this tweet from the White House, where they shared the New York Times headline that says, "Senator meets with wrongly deported Maryland man in El Salvador." And they changed the headline. So they said, "Senator meets with deported MS-13 illegal alien in El Salvador who's never coming back." We also had people get on before Congress under oath. Kristi Noem said there is no scenario where he will return to the United States. Basically, everyone said he's not coming back. We're not bringing him back, even though they deported him wrongfully to El Salvador. There was a removal order prohibiting him from being sent there. He could be deported, but just not there. Vince, do they not have a credibility problem here after doing such a 180, after they were so explicit and bold that he's not coming back? I'm glad they're following the court orders, to be clear, and bringing him back and giving him due process, but it's a galling 180, Vince.
Well, just to be clear, he's not being brought back simply because the administration said, oh, now we're going to bring him back. He's being brought back because he was indicted by a grand jury, not by directly the administration, but by a grand jury for charges of human trafficking. And so what they're doing is now extraditing him so he can be charged. Now, that said, I mean, could I see the case that it created some messaging confusion when you said 100% he's not being brought back and then you do? Sure. But I also think that to a degree, the greater egg here is on the Democrats' face for basically defending this guy, as you said, as the Maryland father. But I would also argue, kind of going back to our earlier discussion, making Kilmar Abrego Garcia the poster child of opposing the Trump agenda on deportations. Now he's coming back to the country to face this gigantic trial on human trafficking of all things. And if that goes obviously the way of him being guilty, or even, there's a lot of evidence or whatever it is, I think that largely, as we brought up earlier, that's going to kind of make a big statement. Oh, what Trump is doing on deportations is correct. Here's the guy that, Democrats did all the stuff, flew to El Salvador for, and it turns out, oh, he's a human trafficker if that conviction comes true. So, I understand it. I did see some people like under my videos saying at the time it happened, he should stay in El Salvador. No need to bring him back with our taxpayer dollars. I get that argument as well. But I also think the big image to the nation, especially when this happens, of a court trial on, again, the poster child of illegal immigration and deportations being for human trafficking, I think, honestly, it's a greater indictment of the Democrat sort of antics and grandstanding rather than Trump.
I just think the Trump administration very clearly lied, though, because they didn't just say he's not coming back. They said we can't bring him back. They said it's not within our power to bring him back. And that was always not true. El Salvador were giving them money. Their president wants to make Trump happy. If they had asked, they would have given him back. And look, if they have a real case against him, great. Bring him back and criminally charge him. Give him his day in court. Yeah, he'll have an attorney. And if he's found guilty, he can rot if he truly did all this horrific stuff. But I mean, this is all really... Some people made the mistake of defending him as a human, saying, no, he's this sweet Maryland man. But some people like myself were just advocating that due process be followed. The Trump administration sent him to a dystopian El Salvador prison where he was just rotting in torturous conditions with no charges and no trial. That's a violation of human rights, even if he's the worst person in the world, Vince.
I'm not an expert on necessarily like extradition laws. My understanding is you cannot necessarily, I believe we have an extradition treaty with El Salvador. I'm going to guess there, right? And so you cannot directly demand someone who is a Salvadorian citizen be returned to the United States without the government's permission, unless like you get, the case where, oh, he's indicted, he's charged. So I think that's a difference here. Again, not an expert on how the specifics of extradition laws work, but that's my understanding of the situation.
They could ask, and they're giving El Salvador millions of dollars of taxpayer money that El Salvador wants to keep, and so they'd be inclined to grant that request, I think. But Anne, I'll bring in you here.
Yeah, I mean, the argument that the most powerful man in the world, who's the United States president, can't convince his friend, the leader of El Salvador, to send Abrego Garcia back is laughable. And Vince, I'm sure that the right will spin this story the way that you had described, but I actually think it does give the Trump administration more credibility to follow through on a unanimous United States Supreme Court ruling indicating that the administration must facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia. Now, in regard to the Democrats supporting a criminal, you could make that argument had he been convicted of human trafficking prior to the Trump administration wrongfully and, in their own admission, accidentally deporting him to El Salvador. But that hadn't happened yet. I'm happy that he's being brought back to the United States to face these charges because everyone deserves due process and their day in court. And if he is found guilty of human trafficking, absolutely he should suffer the consequences of that. I hear what you guys are saying in regard to some Democrats, using emotional manipulation and kind of like laundering this guy's reputation as like this sweet stand-up guy when we really don't know anything about him. However, my view is that most people on the left had a problem with the lack of due process and what that means for everyone else. Once you allow for the erosion of due process for people who are undocumented, that leads to the erosion of due process for American citizens as well. And we just can't have that.
Yeah, Vince, I mean, you mentioned, Anna, people on the left. I'm not on the left, but I am a civil libertarian. So that was my concern all along, was the due process, not just of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but of the dozens, or it may even be up to hundreds of people that we've sent to this El Salvador prison with no charges, with no trials. We are paying for them at U.S. taxpayer expense to be imprisoned in this horrific conditions. They don't have access to their lawyers many times. Sometimes their family doesn't know where they are. I mean, look, I know that he ran on deporting people, but that's not a deportation, sending these people to CDOT, the terrorism center in El Salvador. That's an imprisonment. Why couldn't he just, if these people are here illegally, just deport them the normal way, Vince? Why did he have to go this really, I don't know what the right word is, but draconian path?
Well, I mean, I think it also, especially if you send Salvadorian citizens back to their home country and the government of El Salvador chooses to keep them imprisoned, is that necessarily?
Well, many of them are Venezuelan. Many of the people are from Venezuela that he sent there.
Correct. And many of the suspected Tren de Aragua members who are being deported are being sent there specifically because the nation of Venezuela is in blatant violation of international law by refusing to take back their own citizens. So, there's an argument to be made, I guess, in that direction as well. I'd also like to point out, there's a big thing over the Alien Enemies Act, but when you also look at, for instance, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, I think the exact section there is 237, that under past existing immigration law, you do not need to be convicted of a crime to be deported on an expedited process on the belief of terrorism, considering, again, right, MS-13, the Latin American cartels.
But they're not being deported. They're being imprisoned at U.S. taxpayer expense.
Well, I mean, to that, I would say that, in the case of Venezuela, right, we're having to do that because Venezuela refuses to take back their citizens. I think ideally, you send
so there's no other option
to their home country. So
then sending them to a prison in El Salvador?
Well, the other option would be what? To keep them imprisoned in the U.S.? I mean...
Well, yeah, you could keep them detained in the U.S., or you could also deport them to other countries. I mean, that's also a thing. You could drop them off in Central America, in South America.
Do you think that these other countries are willing to take back those individuals?
Well, we do
I don't know if it's been asked,
deport people to other countries other than the country of their origin.
But listen, do you think that other countries would be willing to take even suspected Tren de Aragua members into the country? I mean... if they want to do that too, I mean, I guess that'd be fine. That's an option. But
can you just put yourself in the shoes for a moment, Vince, of somebody who is picked up by immigration authorities and sent to a prison in a foreign country that is not their home country with no charges and no trial based on a very loose association that they're Tren de Aragua. I mean, they're using like tattoos and stuff, including like Real Madrid tattoos with a soccer ball, tattoos that say mom and dad. You have no lawyer, you have no recourse to get out. That's dystopian. That's horrifying.
Yeah. And it should scare all of us because look, I'll give you a specific anecdote because every time me and my husband travel out of the country and then we come back, obviously we have to go through customs. I think he has one of the most common names ever, Christian Lopez, right? But apparently Christian Lopez is also the name of some wanted, fugitive drug cartel person. So every time we come back to the country, he gets pulled aside for like interrogations, which is super frustrating, but it is what it is. My concern is if you allow for a system in which due process flies out the window, there could be a situation in which there's a case of mistaken identity. Someone like my husband, who was born and raised in the United States, could be mistaken for some undocumented fugitive that's wanted and wrongfully, without having a day in court, without having an opportunity to prove that he is not the person they're looking for, gets deported to freaking El Salvador to a terrorism center. Like, we have to be careful in protecting our rights as we try to move forward in fixing the wrongs of previous administrations or doing what we need to do in order to, deport the right people. Due process is an important part of that process, right?
Vince,
so
you come
that's
in
what
here.
I'm concerned about.
I mean, first of all, I don't think there's been a case where a U.S. citizen has been supposedly accidentally deported. I'm not sure anyone disputes that. Basically everyone who's been deported is either an illegal alien or, if you want to get semantic about it, a case where at least temporary protective status or a temporary visa was revoked. But in the case, right, full discretion to deport those individuals. But on the point of due process, I think this issue is also being drastically misunderstood. Like I was going to finish earlier, under the Immigration Nationality Act of 1952, it does state that you do not need this like standard practice of trial by jury or something to deport an illegal alien, right? Actually, as a matter of fact, if you guys can read up on this, if the Attorney General or State Department determine there is reasonable suspicion, right, probable cause, not it has to be proven, probable cause that a non-resident alien, aka legal alien in this country, has affiliation with foreign terrorist organizations. Now, as of January 20th, again, Latin American cartels being a part of that. Not only are they subject to deportation simply because of that, you do not have to go prove that by jury in court, but also...
Okay.
Well, just let Vince finish the point, and then we'll come
okay.
in.
But also, there is not even necessarily need for like a standard immigration court by this law. Like you can use actually this expedited process where it can be kept secret for national security purposes, etc. So Anna, what would due process mean to you?
No. What you're arguing right now is fair, but what was the probable cause? Especially considering
Tattoos?
the Trump administration's own lawyers admitted that it was an administrative error to deport him. So like what was what was the
did? Yeah. But not that he was like not to be deported. My understanding is basically they didn't finish the process correctly and then accidentally sent him off, but it wasn't that like he was about to be released and set free on the streets. That was not necessarily the timeline. In terms of the probable cause, I mean, you did have the police reports in the past, right? Police officers did identify him as being associated with MS-13. You of course have the 2022 body cam footage that he's now being indicted for in a criminal court. So I think it is sufficient to say there's probable cause he was affiliated with MS-13. Has it necessarily been proven in court? No, but like I said, the law basically argues the probable cause statement, not the criminal conviction statement.
I think that's for so there's two things here. I mean, one, nobody really argues that like every illegal immigrant is entitled to a jury trial before deportation. That's kind of a straw man I hear from kind of MAGA types. Now, a court hearing before an immigration judge, I think, is potentially appropriate in deportation cases. We need more immigration judges because we don't have enough to process them all, and that's a very real problem. But again, I come back to this issue that if all they were was deported on suspicion of being a member of Tren de Aragua and dropped off in their home country, that would not be as much of a due process violation. But to the extent that we are paying El Salvador to imprison these people, then they are essentially in U.S. custody, being imprisoned. So they're being imprisoned without charges or trial. It's not just a deportation. It's an indefinite imprisonment in horrible conditions that's being done only based on, like what you said, this probable cause, that they're using tattoos and other spurious evidence. But let's concede it's probable cause. They're not just doing deportations. They're doing imprisonment. That's the issue I have with it, Vince.
Well, again, as I'm going to keep coming back to this point, I think then the responsibility falls back on Venezuela to take back their own citizens. I mean, I think that would be the cleanest solution to the problem.
Anna?
Like, I don't think it's ideal that we're sending them to El Salvador, you know? I mean,
yeah, I mean, and it's not ideal that Venezuela isn't complying with the United States, probably because of how the U.S. has, treated Venezuela with like sanctions and things like that. But nonetheless, I would argue that ultimately what is the least ideal is, again, having a government, a federal government that's so powerful that they can unilaterally accuse anyone of anything, argue that there's probable cause, invoke the Alien Enemies Act, and then deport someone without allowing them to see a judge, at least have a day before a judge to make their case. I don't understand why that's so complicated and why Trump supporters are so against allowing that happen when that's such an important protection of human rights, including protection from a government against Americans potentially being wrongfully accused of crimes and deported.
Or legal immigrants. I think that's more common, but it can also
or legal
happen to
immigrants,
Americans.
yeah.
But Anna, I guess to kind of, I'm not endorsing this position, but what they say is that, listen, we've let 20 million illegal immigrants into the country. We need to get them all out. And it's impossible to do that and give everyone a day in court and fair process. That's and so they argue that the due process argument hamstrings their ability to do what the president campaigned on, was elected to do, and what they think is necessary for national security and economic security. I don't really agree. And I say, okay, well, then you can't do it, is my answer. But how do you respond to that? Because I think it's a valid frustration at the very least. Because, I mean, the Biden administration opened up the border for the refugee and asylum system to be abused. Millions of people can come in here, and then it's much harder to get them out. I'm sympathetic to that frustration.
Right. Well, I'm sorry that the government is having such a tough time dealing with a system of government that wants to protect human rights, but human rights and the protection of human rights differentiates countries like the United States from dystopian, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes. And I would prefer a process that takes a little bit longer, but again, has the importance of due process and human rights at at front and center, as opposed to doing things rapidly with a government that's so empowered that they trample on human rights. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree,
Well,
but
I guess-
Vince, I assume you have a different perspective.
What ought the process? What should what should due process be in that case? Because for me, it's like, okay, if you prove, whether it's in a judge or an administrative issue or whatever, you prove that they're an illegal alien, right? They're not here in the country. They're not a citizen. Well, obviously, we should prove that part, right? Writ of habeas corpus is, I think, what they are legally entitled to, but necessarily, depending on the case, the whole long hearing is not necessarily applying in every single situation. If those two are true, then I think, you have grounds to deport. And yeah, I mean, should the Trump administration figure out a way to expedite, figure out how to get more immigration judges or something so you can have the expedited process, but also the due process, I guess, sure. But, my general
Do you think that everyone's getting their writ of habeas corpus? I don't.
I don't know. I mean,
I'm not. I mean, had Abrego Garcia had just, it's not that complicated. Okay, we're not talking about a multi-month court case with like a jury trial. It's literally giving this individual an opportunity to make their case in front of a judge. Had that happened, the Trump administration would not have made that administrative error. This wouldn't have been a big national story. And by the way, let me just give the right a word of advice as someone who, I don't even know if I identify as like on the left, right? I have left-wing ideas, economically speaking, but when it comes to some of the cultural things that the Democrats have gotten involved in, I'm not in favor of it. But that's beside the point. The left lost people when they started engaging in activities that were deeply unpopular, but they were so out of touch and so stubborn that they refused to see it. You're right in that currently Trump is enjoying, relative popularity and favorability when it comes to his immigration policies. But if you notice the numbers from the beginning of his second term to what they are now, it's been steadily dropping. And I think the reason why is because you have these high profile cases like Abrego Garcia, where people look at it, especially independent voters who switched over to vote for Trump. They're looking at cases like that and thinking, that seems super unfair. That seems like way too much power concentrated in the executive branch. I actually really appreciate due process. I want to protect that. So I think that the right would be well suited in actually pushing back against those types of mistakes in order to maintain support for Trump's immigration policies. But that takes strategic thinking. And right now, we don't have a country where strategic thinking is incentivized, unfortunately.
No, I totally hear what you're saying, but I think, other things to keep in mind is, first of all, it's kind of also, I would argue, just a result of the presidential honeymoon wearing off. I mean, would you acknowledge, sometimes, yeah, there are people who vote for things, and then when they happen, they're like, oh, right. That's kind of a general trend in any presidential term, is like they get into office, they're riding high, they slowly decline. Most polls, you're right, that show the numbers dropping a bit on deportation also show the overall approval rating dropping. And so it's also questions of like, is it a Democrat sample more, Republican sample this or that? But still, overwhelmingly, even despite all of the constant attacks, the constant media coverage, all this stuff, I still continue to notice that, first of all, the approval rating on immigration is usually at least 5 to 10 points more popular than his general approval rating, which still tells me a lot, I think, to this day. And, I think even when you look back at, the election period, all this stuff, I mean, overwhelmingly, this is an issue, I think, that the left has made this argument for a long time, but they're going to be kind of surprised to find out that this is still overwhelmingly pretty popular with the people. That said, I do take your point, because that's something I think about every single day. How do we not become like the left, right? Because the left basically went from Obama 2008 to completely being kind of like ridiculed, I guess, in 2024. How do we make sure that did not happen? But that said, I would have to disagree. I just don't see the deportations as one of them. Maybe something you could argue election period, like abortion, for instance. That was something Trump kind of played strategically well, but I just disagree on the immigration front.
Right. I mean, you mentioned something really interesting there, Vince, which is how do we not become like the left? And I come at this as from the perspective of who, maybe I'm on the center right politically now, but my political awakening was kind of an aversion or being horrified at left-wing excesses in hyper-woke spaces. I grew up in Massachusetts. I went to a super far left college. What I was mortified by was the attempts to suppress speech, the attempts to punish people without due process. I was actually one of the things in my younger years that made me like look askance at the Democratic Party was the disdain with which Brett Kavanaugh was treated in terms of due process for these accusations made against him, some of which were credible, some of which were not, but were treated as such, but people just determined to destroy him. And I see the Trump administration, whether you want to call it the woke right or not, I see them censoring people. I see them picking people up and throwing them into unmarked vans because they wrote an op-ed criticizing Israel, right? I see them engaging in some of these behaviors. I see them talking about like protecting safe spaces from anti-Semitism, which they define very broadly. I mean, do you not see any patterns playing out here now that it's their turn in power? I certainly do, Vince, but what do you think?
Well, do you see the Palestine campus stuff and illegal immigration as like the same issue? Because I'd argue they're sort of, I guess, somewhat aligned, but somewhat distinct from each other at the same time.
They're different issues, but some of the principles at stake of free speech, due process can be similar.
Mm-hmm. I mean, look, my thing on, for instance, like the Palestine stuff is like, yeah, do I think that people should be deported simply for protesting? No, but I also think, hey, if you're here in this country, generally speaking, whether it's Israel or any other issue, right? If you're breaking laws or you're engaged in, you saw some of the situations that went on at Columbia and other universities. Not all of the protesting is legal, I'll say that. Violence, whether that's violence or just like trespassing and other things. I generally think that the administration has a point. Hey, if you're here on a student visa and you're breaking laws or agitating in certain senses, I mean, why did we bring you here in the first place, right?
But they're not just doing people who broke laws. I would have much less of an issue if they were just deporting people who trespassed or did vandalism. They are deporting anyone, in Marco Rubio's own words, whose presence undermines the U.S. foreign policy, right? Just because they disagree with support for Israel or other things. And I think that's a dangerous precedent. I think that's a violation of civil liberties, because I mean, that same logic could be used by a future president AOC to deport pro-Israel students or to deport Dr. Jordan Peterson for opposing U.S. support for Ukraine under the Biden administration. I mean, Anna, Republicans are not going to be in power forever. And some of the things they're doing, it feels to me like Democrats a few years ago when they were like getting rid of the judicial filibuster and agitating to get rid of the filibuster and other things, like if they had achieved all of it, would be biting them even harder. Now, I feel like Republicans are in a similar moment.
I'm in favor of getting rid of the judicial filibuster. And I say that even now with Republicans enjoying a slim majority in the Senate. I think we should decide legislation on a simple majority. I think the legislative filibuster is, yeah, it's there specifically to ensure bills go to die. Okay. And it's pathetic and it infuriates me. Yeah. So, but your point is very valid, Brad, because again, it's so important to think about the abuses of power that your own side is engaging in. And if you're tempted to support it simply because your own side is in power, well, you're making a huge mistake because your side's not always going to be in power. And if you're okay with your side doing it, you have to be okay with the opposing party doing the same.
All right, guys. Well, I've really appreciated this conversation. Thank you both so much for your time. We'll have to have you back another time, but thank you both.
Thank you.